Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 5th NECAT New England Coalition Against Trafficking Advanced Learning Series webinar. As we've mentioned a couple times, there's a poll up. Please feel free to answer that just to give the presenters a better idea of who's in the audience today joining us. This webinar today will be recorded and then will be uploaded to our website, so feel free to check that out. There's 4 other Advanced Learning Series webinars that we've posted to our website. And that website is necattogether.squarespace.com. And I'll also write that to the right here in our chat box as well. So you can feel free to check out those past webinars as well. And definitely feel free to share today's webinars with your circles as well. So today we're so excited to hear from our presenters, Rachel and Amanda, and we're really grateful that all of you guys have joined us today.
We're really excited today to introduce today the speakers. They are 2 people who I respect, appreciate how they use their professional expertise, drive, and willingness to work against human trafficking. NECAT is thankful to have Rachel Nemec and Amanda Fowle with us. Amanda is here representing Plymouth County's Children Advocacy Center and the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office. And Rachel is representing the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. Rachel, she's an adult and adolescent and pediatric sexual assault nurse examiner for the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. And Amanda Fowle is the Director of Human Trafficking Prosecutions for the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office. Thank you very much, Rachel. Thank you very much, Amanda.
Thank you, Oscar. All right, we are gonna go right to our PowerPoint. So for those of you that didn't have a chance to answer, you can kind of tell us in the comment box who you are representing. Here we go. So we are here to talk to you guys about how to leverage your multidisciplinary team so we can effectively engage with youth who are being exploited or who are at risk for being exploited. So Amanda and I are going to share both our perspectives as providers in very different roles, and then how we have worked together over the past 5.5 years to build a more effective and collaborative approach, specifically as it pertains to exploited youth, who is the population that we work mostly with. As we go through the presentation, if you guys have questions, you are more than welcome to put them down in the chat box. We can see that as we're going. But we all are also going to leave some time at the end for our Q&A session. So please feel free to use that time as well.
Just a quick legal disclaimer, as far as when we refer to any law-specific issues that we deal with here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. If that doesn't necessarily comport with your state, wherever you're coming in from, talk to your local attorneys, your local county attorneys, state's attorneys, whoever the proper office might be, to see if there's something equivalent that you're working with, or obviously if you're working from the federal level, that would be a little different as well.
All right, so here are some of our objectives. We trust that you guys can read these, but really we want you to take away things that are pertinent to your roles and how to be effective multidisciplinary team members. We can see from the polling that we did that, you know, not all of you are from law enforcement. We have a really different and a nice wide array of participants. So please feel free to, like I said before, to ask us questions that pertain to how your role might be more effective in responding to youth who are being exploited. We do want to start with a bit of a content warning. We do recognize that this material is hard to sit with. So please do what you need to take care of yourself. This is going to be recorded, so it will be available in the future if you get kicked off or you need to go and do something else. But while we're speaking, please take care of yourself. So we also wanted to throw up some important terms and acronyms. We realize sometimes in the work that we do that we are guilty of using acronyms a lot, and sometimes not everyone that we're talking to understands these. So this is kind of our disclaimer. You are more than welcome to ask us to explain the acronyms that we might throw around, but here are the most common. So when we use the term CAC, we're referring to a Children's Advocacy Center, which is the location that we do most of our work from. Amanda, of course, represents the District Attorney's Office, and I, of course, represent the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. But most of the work that we do together is within a Children's Advocacy Center, where our multidisciplinary team gets together to handle the investigation and the care of minors that we come in contact with. We use the term CSEC when we're talking about the commercial sexual exploitation of children, but you might hear that being referred to, and we might say something like an exploited youth. You might hear the term human trafficking or domestic minor sex trafficking, which can refer to these cases as well. Our MDT or multidisciplinary team, my role as a pediatric sexual assault nurse examiner, we refer to it often as a PD-SANE. And just to confuse everyone, we also have a similar sounding acronym for the network of people that come together for the investigation of child abuse cases. We will try to refer to that process as a forensic interview instead of SANE, because our other acronym SANE, that stands for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner, can just make everything a lot more confusing. And then when we talk about the youth that we're serving, we will interchangeably use the terms victim, survivor, or youth. Depending on what discipline you come from, you will hear those words used to reflect the kids that we serve. So we want to start by talking a little bit about how we started this work. Some of you, particularly those in Massachusetts, might be familiar with the rollout of a statewide grant whose mission was to increase the capacity of counties in our state in their response to child sexual exploitation cases. So Plymouth County was the 8th county to participate in this initiative. And at the time that the initial survey was sent around to us, there were only 2 cases that we had identified or that had come in as a referral for CSEC. So as you can see, we were either not capturing these cases for what they were, or they weren't happening, which is less likely. So we began our involvement in the fall of 2017. You can see in 2019, we had 77 referrals for CSEC, which when we looked at that data, we both said to ourselves, like, that feels really low for the amount of work that we're doing. And I think one of the reasons for that is because the cases that we had come into us in 2017, 2018, and 2019, a lot of them overlap. And so a lot of our open referrals right now came from those years as well. So the 77 really is referring to new referrals to our CSEC coordinators at our Children's Advocacy Center and DA's office. And then we have open cases that come from years past.
Our first human trafficking prosecutions actually started before our involvement with the statewide grant. One of our first prosecutions, we actually prosecuted one of the first juvenile human traffickers in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We did that in 2016. That was also around the time that we, as Plymouth County, started to take on more of the adult cases as well. We had started to see really just the indication of these cases developing and realizing what we were missing, and then spend more time focusing on trying to recognize where our where our failure was as to how we hadn't been recognizing these cases before. So then we started kind of proactively training ourselves, and then we were able to get the grant, which was amazing and a huge help in recognizing these cases.
So one of the first things that I think we realized was that the cases that we were receiving that had to do with the exploitation of youth really required us to think outside the box in terms of what our response was going to look like. And I think any of you who work with youth who are either at risk for exploitation or who are being exploited know that you can't really handle their case the same way that you handle your traditional child sexual abuse cases. There are lots of complexities, not only in how we have to approach the youth themselves, but also what it takes to really create a solid case around their abuse. So one of the things we learned pretty quickly was that our forensic interview process needed to change, and maybe Amanda can speak to a little bit of that.
Yeah, so we were realizing that we were putting a lot of children in situations that they didn't want to be in, and it was kind of a backwards way of thinking from how we usually do things, because generally speaking, with a traditional sexual assault case, for anybody that's worked one of those, you know that the traditional sexual assault case always has to start with the disclosure, right? Who, where, all of that information, so that you can start building the case around those things. We were realizing that with the CSEC cases, we already kind of had an idea of the where, and usually we kind of had an idea of the who, and we had a lot more information that we could gather in order to actually present to the child, because these children were not always wanting to be the most forthcoming with us, usually from a safety perspective, right? If they turned into the rat, then they were going to be in trouble. It was very similar to dealing with a gang unit prosecution, for example. You don't want, the person in the gang isn't going to want to rat out their other gang members because it puts a target on their back, and they're really, in some ways, signing their death warrant. So we were trying to take that responsibility off of our children. And how do we do that? We start gathering the evidence ahead of time, and that meant pushing off things like the forensic interview so that we could gather that information. But it also meant training our forensic interviewers in a more federal model to be able to actually present these children with the information. So if you can present a child with the list of text messages where they're setting up dates, or where they're being lured by, their exploiter, or where they're talking about money, or where there are pictures being exchanged, you can present that to them and say, we already know that this is out there. What can you tell us about this? Then it takes some of the pressure off of them. They're no longer a rat, and in some extent, or at least as not as much of a rat, and to some extent have some control over the story that they're able to tell. Like, we already know this picture is out there. What can you tell us about this picture? Oh, that picture was taken, I volunteered for that picture, or that picture was taken at this hotel, and information like that we can then turn around and continue to follow up on. And sometimes it allows them to give us information that, frankly, they don't even realize that they're giving us. They confirm a hotel. We can then go and get the hotel records, and we can get that additional evidence and information, and we're building a stronger case, regardless of if that child stays on board for the prosecution or not. And that was one of the more important things for us to learn, is how do we take as much pressure off of that child in order to be able to still prosecute these cases as we go forward. So there is a question being posed about the federal forensic interview model. For at least some of their forensic interviews, I believe they do it on a case-specific and charge-specific basis, but they're actually able to present evidence to the child. So, for example, if they have a case that involves pictures of the child, which we often do in human trafficking cases, because the child is being photographed and advertised online, or they're sending pictures in direct images and direct messages, they're able to present that information to the child directly to say, what can you tell us about this? As opposed to in Massachusetts, our general forensic interview standard for a general, more traditional physical or sexual assault case is that we bring the child in, we ask them very open-ended questions and let us walk through everything that happened. We don't present in our traditional sexual or physical abuse forensic interviews that child with any type of evidence. We gather all of the evidence from them and then go from there. So this is really kind of flipping that whole script around so that we can do that presentation.
So these are the roles that we pretty quickly sort of got together as our internal CSEC team. So our chief of the Family Protection Unit at the District Attorney's Office, our CAC director, who also works for the district attorney's office, our human trafficking prosecutor, who's Amanda, our CSEC coordinator, who is located at the Children's Advocacy Center but works for the district attorney's office, our forensic interviewer, who is very similar to that coordinator in where they work and who they respond to, and then our PDSANE, which is my role there. So we developed our internal team, and really what that meant was we were actively discussing every case that came in and really thinking about what is the best way to proceed with this specific child, right? So it was very individualized, and it has grown considerably since we started.
And one of the things to note there is that everybody on our list, and this is not exclusive to Plymouth County, but unique to Plymouth County because it does change throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, everybody on that list, with the exception of the PDSANE nurse, is actually a district attorney employee. Our Children's Advocacy Center is DA based, which means we all work in the same section. Our CAC is not a nonprofit or anything like that. Some of the CACs in Massachusetts are. Ours, however, is not. So the only outsider, so to speak, is DPH with the PDSANE.
So we're going to just walk through one of our earlier cases, and really the reason why we talk a lot about this case is not so much because it was a success, because believe me, it wasn't in all ways. But what it did help us do really early on was change really the way that we thought about these cases and the way that we worked together as a team. Do you want to walk through the case?
Yeah, so this case can really be defined any other way but a success, at least initially. But we were able to turn it into a bit more of a successful situation. So back in 2017, we had a juvenile female. She was about 14 years old. She, like many juvenile females, like to spend a lot of time on social media. She had an individual reach out to her via social media application, Snapchat, that I'm sure most of you are at least vaguely familiar with by now. And the two of them started to engage in conversation where she was looking for drugs and he was willing to give her drugs in exchange for things like her underwear or pictures of her in her underwear or things of that nature. There was a number of underlying or background things going on. It was just her and her mom. She, was doing well in school. She had this, theoretically relatively normal life, except for the fact that she had this kind of background situation going on of exchanging things that she didn't think was a big deal in exchange for drugs and things that she wanted while she was handling other issues. We did our traditional initial model of bringing her in for a forensic interview to try and see what more information we could get. We brought her in for the first interview at the time that her phone was being forensically examined to see what digital evidence was out there on her phone. And most people can tell when they're being lied to, and I think we were lied to for 85% of this interview. She was embarrassed. She didn't want to tell us. She didn't want to admit to things. She was afraid that her mom was going to find out certain things and her mom was going to be upset. And she didn't want to get these guys in trouble because she felt that she had some sort of rapport relationship with them. Once we got the phone back, we realized that we had a really big problem. Number one, we had just, kind of forced our way into this girl's life to get her to lie on tape, which didn't sit well with any of us. We looked at the information from the phone. We knew we were going to have to talk to her again. We chose at that point, I think it was around then that our first forensic interviewer came back from her training and said, hey, we can actually present her with this evidence, but this will be my first time doing it. So we went ahead and did that. We presented her with the stuff that we had gotten from the phone, gave her the opportunity to explain it, put it, in the recorded forensic interview, basically redid that whole thing, and gave her the opportunity in interview number 2 to explain why she hadn't been so honest in interview number 1. We also realized that there were a number of other failures. One of them being that the whole reason we had brought her in so quickly for a forensic interview is because we wanted to make sure that she was safe, and we wanted to make sure that she knew that people cared about her and the dangers of some of the behavior that she was, engaging in. And we realized there was a better way to do that. We created something called a meet the team model, where there's a team of us. It's usually myself, it's either Rachel or somebody else, another PDC nurse. We have the CSEC coordinators and hopefully the interviewer, as well as preferably law enforcement there. We don't do an interview. We just sit in a really nice room at our Children's Advocacy Center and all talk about what our day is like. We introduce ourselves, we talk about what we do, we talk about some of the resources that are available. We let them know that we're going to want them to come in for an interview at some point if they're willing. And we let them know that, quite frankly, we know that they're up to, some questionable behavior that we're concerned about. So we don't lie to them ever. But we also don't force them at that point in time to do anything that they don't necessarily want to do. We were also able to find some resources for them, including GEMS, Girls Educated in Mentoring Services. They put out a journal that we were able to purchase a number of so that we could give it out to some of these girls that we knew were engaged in this type of behavior, that perhaps didn't at that point want to share with us that they were engaged in that type of behavior, so that they could have that to look at. We give them numbers, we give them our numbers, we give them numbers for the National Human Trafficking Hotline, anything that we feel that they can use, we send them home with, in hopes that eventually they'll come back to us.
And we also allow them the opportunity to have medical care provided on that day. So the way we typically handle our cases is that we will have a child in for a forensic interview, and then they get to come downstairs into the medical suite and meet with me one-on-one to make sure that we're also meeting their medical needs and their health needs. And so for these kids, we might not know. So traditionally that happens after we have all the information about their abuse history. And so my medical care is very much dictated by the child's account of what happened to him or her. But for these cases, because we don't always have that information from the get-go, when we have these kids come in for their meet the team opportunities, they get to come in and make sure that we do the appropriate testing and really have the conversations that are important for maintaining their health and their safety. And we can do that privately on that day. That way, we're not waiting for them to come back, which we know sometimes doesn't happen. So we're really attending to their needs when we have the captive audience. In this particular case that we were talking about, when she came down after her forensic interview, one of the things that she shared with me privately was that it would have been really nice to know kind of what this process was like beforehand, right? And we can all understand what that must feel like. I think, if we come from an empathetic place, we can understand, like, who are these people and what are they asking of me and what's going to happen if I share this information with them. So when we redesigned this process and we developed the Meet the Team model, it really is an opportunity for the kid to ask those questions. And sometimes they're asking law enforcement, things like, if I come in and tell you something, does that mean you're automatically going out and arresting someone, right? And sometimes we can't always answer their questions as exact as we want to, but what we can do is say, well, that's going to depend, right? And no one likes that kind of answer. I call that the attorney answer, but it's true. And sometimes what these kids need most is just someone to be real with them. And so we're acknowledging that we can't expect them to trust us. But we can tell them what our roles are, what our concerns are, without talking specifically about case details, but really just being invested and safe adults. We can talk about what our roles are and what our roles are not. So having those very clear boundaries around which of us can do what and who they can reach out to when they need something. And we leave it open-ended, like Amanda said. There's no expectation that an interview is going to happen. So this really is all about meeting the needs of that specific child.
And to the extent that there's a question about the role of DCF in that process, I'm going to give the first attorney answer of the day and say that it depends. And it depends on how the child is coming to us. A number of our cases, DCF is the one that is bringing the child to us with regards to either by way of the child being in DCF care, or there being, you know, a 51A that was filed and DCF investigating that way. So there are a number of different ways that DCF could be involved. Some of them, sometimes DCF isn't involved. Sometimes it's the parents that bring the child in. It all depends on what DCF's involvement is kind of ahead of time when we do the meet the team. Generally speaking, for our multidisciplinary team, DCF is regularly involved. They're actually one of our main team members as far as an ongoing worker or response worker anytime the 51A is filed. And then we kind of work around the team to see who has the best relationship with the child to talk about bringing that child in, either for a forensic interview or a meet the team aspect, depending on which way that case is going to go.
So one of the things we talk about pretty regularly as a team is how are the ways that we're handling these cases sometimes unintentionally mimicking what their relationships with their exploiters are like. So we'll give you an example. When we ask a child to come into our location and we put them on camera and we don't really explain the why and the what, and we're just sort of expecting them to share some really horrific details of their life with us, and they're not really sure what they're getting in return or what that's going to mean for them, we are putting a child who is very used to having to negotiate their safety for something, for their body, frankly. And so we become people who are participating in that dynamic as like their exploiters and like their buyers do. And so we have to be mindful of really what are we doing that looks like a setup to some of these kids. And sometimes we can't change the way we do everything, but we can at least have ongoing dialogue about what are the things that we're doing that really might be triggering for these youth. That the paradox of decision-making versus empowerment, for those who have ever worked with either exploited youth or people in domestic violence relationships, you might understand that after being in a position where you're maybe not the one making all of the decisions, it's really difficult then to be in a position where people are empowering you to make critical decisions about your life and about your safety. It may have become something that you're not particularly comfortable or used to doing. And so we have to walk the fine line of allowing them to make really important and critical decisions for themselves, but also laying out what those decisions might mean down the road, and what we can potentially do to help keep them safe. And sometimes there's not a lot we can do for that, but what we can do is be honest about what our limitations are as specific team members. So one of the things that we think about a lot is location. So traditionally, we interview kids in the county where a crime occurred. So if a crime occurs in Plymouth County, we do the forensic interview in Plymouth County. But we've had cases where kids will tell us, it doesn't feel safe for me. I can't come to that location. It's too much for me. And so we have to think critically about what are our options. Can we send a team to another county and ask them to provide a space for us, so that we're not putting this child either at real risk, in real danger, or just upsetting them enough that they can't participate in a forensic interview. And so we've had to do that a number of times. Know your team members' strengths and their weaknesses, and that's not a judgment. There are people on your team that are going to be both better just from a practical perspective and also able to do certain things. So for example, I'm the medical provider on the team, so most of the time it makes sense for me to be the one to talk about STI testing or pregnancy testing or things like that. But if a team member has a better rapport with a child, a group home worker, for example, has a really solid relationship, then our egos don't get hurt by those people being the ones to initiate conversation and building that relationship with other team members.
And that's one of the biggest things about the team, quite frankly, is knowing your strengths and weaknesses, checking your ego at the door, but also your weaknesses by way of what they share with you. So for example, as the prosecutor, right, anything I know about this child most likely has to get turned over to the defense attorney. I should not be the one that talks to that child about making sure they have proper counseling services in place, because I am then setting that child up really kind of for failure, because I'm saying, hey, this should be your counseling service idea. You know, here are the different options for you. And if that child turns around and says, I'm going with option B, and tells me that as the prosecutor, I have to turn to the defense attorney and say, this child is going to counseling option B. And what's that defense attorney going to do? That defense attorney is going to summons in those records from counseling option B and everything that that child is doing to try and, you know, work through whatever they need to work through is going to now become part of this case. And that defense attorney is going to have access to all of that information, instead of counseling being what it really should be, which is a safe place for that child to go and work through whatever they need to go through. So the strengths and weaknesses come in all different forms. For example, some people would also describe me as not warm and fuzzy. That's probably one of my weaknesses for some of these children that we see. The flip side is, for some of these children that come in and are just angry and hurt and mad, sometimes that's my strength, is that they can come in and yell and be angry with me, and I'm okay with it. And I can deal with that, and we can move past it, and that's how we end up building a rapport. So there's no formula to figure that out, but if you understand what your role in the case is and what your limitations and obligations are going to be, then it helps you figure out what the strengths and weaknesses for you and other people in your team really are.
And also knowing your team members. So I know that very much about Amanda, but I also know that when I'm meeting with kids one-on-one, I know who needs that kind of response just in talking with them. I know who's going to need a straight shooter, someone who's going to tell them an answer to their question in the way they need to hear it, or who's going to tell them, I can't answer that question, right? Because honesty, however that looks, is much more important than someone who's going to try to tiptoe around the answer to that kid's question. So I know if I tell one of our kids, listen, if you have a really great question there, I'm not the person on our team who's best, I can't answer that for you, but Amanda, who you met at the Meet the Team out there, you know, she can answer that. And I know her. I work with her very well. And so I know she's going to give you a straight answer. You might not like her straight answer, but she's not going to lie to you. So there's value in knowing your team members and then helping to build that rapport for the child. Oh, sorry.
We have another poll for you.
Yeah, sorry, we're just pulling up another poll here. Okay. Of course, it's not letting me show you the question. I should be able to. So I'm gonna read the question for you because it should be coming up, but it's not. I apologize for that. I believe this is the same. For those of you who are on Mentimeter, hopefully you can still see this question. I don't think it's a different code. But the question is, you have a 16-year-old female who has multiple reports of running from a group home. Her friends that she runs with say that she's performing oral sex to stay at 123 Main Street within your county. But our question is, what do you do next? A, wait until she's recovered to get a statement. B, start looking into 123 Main Street. C, talk to her friends. D, A and B. Or E, B and C. We'll give you just a second to answer that. If you need me to read that again, just let me know in the chat box. Okay, we're going to close the poll in 5, 4, thank you, Mary, 3, 2, 1. Awesome.
All right, so the correct answer is E. The correct answer is to do B and C. Why? Because we don't know when she's going to get recovered necessarily. So if you can turn around and start looking into the address, 123 Main Street, number of different things that you can find out, right? Are there cameras in the area? Are there convenience stores around the area that have security systems? What is in that area that you could look into to see, is she maybe still there, right? Can you see her coming and going? Can you see who else is coming and going from that particular location so that she doesn't have to turn around and say, no, I was never there. Instead, you can present her with pictures of her being at that address and she can know, oh, you already know I was there. So I'm not giving up anything. I'm not ratting anybody out by saying, yeah, that's a picture of me, but it's not what you think or whatever she may say. Also, talk to her friends. Find out, maybe they'll know where she is. It's really hard for a teenager to go without any form of social media, and they always follow their friends on social media. So if there's some indication that maybe her friends know where she is, maybe her friends know where she checked in, maybe she sent a snap to her friends about where she is or how she's feeling, you can gather all of that information so that if and when she is recovered, then you can, work to meet her needs as well as work to continue to build the case. So if she's telling her friends that she doesn't feel safe, obviously medical should always be some of the top priority, but especially if she's not feeling safe where she is and she's recovered very quickly after that. It could also give you an indication of other places to look for information. So if 123 Main Street, for example, is a hotel, you can get the hotel records for the days that it looks like she's there, for the days that she sends her friends messages saying that she's there, or days that match up with the street cameras or the hotel surveillance that shows she's there. Find out who has been renting that hotel room, or how long have they been staying? Are they bringing other girls into that area? So you can find out a lot of that background information that just starts with the fact that she's staying at 123 Main Street.
And just for clarification purposes, if you're not law enforcement, we're not suggesting that you're doing this kind of recon on 123 Main Street, for obvious safety reasons. Certainly, if you already happen to know about things, and sharing that with your local law enforcement or district attorney's office is an important step. So just wanted to throw that out there.
So challenges and timing of evidence collection is a lot. So I'm going to break this into kind of at least 2 different categories to the extent that I can. Obviously, collecting evidence, you need to know what evidence to be aware of, things like obtaining electronic devices like phones, iPads, things like that, verifying identities and that information, as well as obviously, again, and I can't stress this enough, and not just because Rachel's sitting next to me, but the potential of medical evidence. So to split this up to law enforcement agencies, law enforcement tends to know, I hope you know, I'll give you guys all the benefit of the doubt that you guys know the areas where there are city cams or surveillance cameras in your jurisdiction. Other things to think about is, how is the child getting to that place in your jurisdiction? Are there rideshare programs? Is there Uber? Is there Lyft? Are they using that, to get to, I'll take that 123 Main Street address again, because if they're using an Uber and you see on the city cam that there are Ubers that drop these kids off, you can do a search warrant to Uber and say, we're investigating a human trafficking case. We want all the Uber records for this week time frame for every single Uber that dropped off people at 123 Main Street. They'll give that to you. They'll give you who the driver is. They'll give you usually how many fares are in that car, and they'll give you the timing that it happened. So it would help, could potentially help narrow down more video that you might be looking for, or other things of that nature. Paperwork, like I said, trying to figure out who's renting the hotel room, or who is the house itself owned by or rented by, who's on the lease, that type of information that you can always try and track down. And then the phone is obviously one of the big ones, the electronic devices. Search warrants you can get search warrants for the individual social media accounts. You can get search warrants for Snapchat. You can get a search warrant for Facebook, Instagram, the list goes on. You can get search warrants for the phone itself if you're able to recover the phone. You can get search warrants for cell phone towers. All of that information to try and figure out as much as you can about when is the child there, and who are they communicating with, who else might be in the area. And all of that is relatively time sensitive. Snapchat, for example, has a relatively low retention period. I think it's potentially as low as 30 days, depending on who is viewing snaps and what the settings are and Snap Map and everything else. So you want to work on getting those preservation letters out and getting those search warrants done, likely before you even meet the child, even before the child is recovered. From a social services or victim services perspective, if you guys are the ones that have a rapport with the child, if you're talking to the child, perhaps it's somebody that you've worked with before and maybe they reach out to you while they're on the run. They might give you general location. They might say that they're in Plymouth, or they might say that they're in Fall River or wherever it may be. And they might not give you their specific location, but at least they'll give you a general idea so that you can turn around and say, hey, Plymouth Police, or hey, Fall River, or Quincy, or Boston, or wherever it might be. They might also give you nicknames of who people are, and then that nickname might not mean much to you, but it might mean a lot to the Fall River Police Department or to the Brockton Police Department. Also, if it's something where you're talking to the child and you actually have that child with you, they might just start saying some weird stuff. They might talk about, the days they got their nails done and, different dates or different people, different things that they noticed. Like they might start talking about the guy that always wore the weird shoes. Again, that stuff might not seem like a huge deal to you, but it is something that could be a piece of corroboration or lead to a big piece of evidence down the road. So if you take note of all of that, as well as timing, right? If you find the child on a Friday and that child is comfortable telling you when the last time they had any level of interaction with anybody, whether it's sexual interaction or, when the last time they saw somebody that they were safe with, that could help us narrow down timing of trying to get medical evidence or something like that. And then it always comes back to the phone. How did that child get the phone? Who's paying for that phone? Is it their parents? Is it their friend? Is it them? I know some within Plymouth County, some of our DCF workers or even our DYS workers have developed kind of a contract with some of our kids about that worker needing to have access to the phone. And so they share that password with the DYS worker. And then if that DYS worker wants to share it with law enforcement, then we can go from there. Where does all of this evidence go? And this is one of the big things about Massachusetts. Massachusetts does not require force, fraud, or coercion element. Many of your states might be different. I know the federal model is different. They do require that. We don't, so it makes our cases a little bit easier. What is one of my main goals anyway is not to be the new exploiter. We don't want to have our case be the latest thing exploiting that child. So we want to do as much as we can to build up a case that maybe doesn't need that child to even come in and testify if we can. Other concerns obviously are, and if you guys can tell that I'm starting to speed up a little bit, it's because we're working on running out of time here. So other concerns obviously are if that child is involved in criminal activity, like whether it's shoplifting, whether it's drugs, whether it's weapon charges, whether it's assault and battery charges because they're beating up other people in the house. All of those things are things that we have to be aware of as law enforcement and as attorneys. So if it's something that you guys as a service provider know about, then please also let us know.
And I think we also have to get honest about how criminal activity is very much a common element in a lot of these cases. And that means that the youth themselves can be involved in criminal activity. And I know, sort of speaking from personal experience, that was one of the ways that my exploiters were really good at keeping me quiet, right? So as a teenager who was involved in this, I knew that if I wanted to access providers for help, there was a very good chance that or at least I thought, that there was a possibility I could get in trouble for some of the things that were going on around me, some of the things that I was involved in. And so that was a huge deterrent for accessing help. So we just have to be honest about that and be real with the kids that we serve, that we kind of expect this to be part of their life. So I just want to get into quickly kind of the underlying understanding that we all have to have in terms of the attachment that forms between victims and their exploiters. This was a really nice quote that came out of a study by O'Brien in 2018. The citation is in our resources. We'll give that to you in a bit. But if you haven't read this study, it's a really great one on really the trauma bonding that occurred between victims and their exploiters. So this was just a really great quote that I wanted to share with you guys. So that trauma coerced attachment, also known as trauma bonds, you'll hear that phrase a lot. It's a lot like when we work with people who have experienced domestic violence. There's this chronic control and power imbalance. It's not a stable attachment at all. It is, victims go from feeling connected and loved by their exploiter to identifying the fact that this person is potentially really dangerous and is not a healthy person for me. So it's dynamic in that sense. There is that intermittent delivery of reward and punishment, and so that back and forth. And that becomes really confusing for the victim, particularly our younger victims who this might be their first serious relationship with someone. So we want to remind service providers that this attachment didn't happen overnight and therefore can't be undone overnight. So when we put a kid in a room and we ask them questions about someone who really means something to them, we have to be mindful of that. We can't call this person, we might think that they're a bad or unsafe person, but calling them names and speaking about them poorly is only going to force the victim further away from us. So identifying, particularly for social service providers that are listening, identifying what's good about this relationship and then maybe what's not so healthy. So helping a kid to sort of think through what are the pros and cons of this relationship is a really helpful step. We have to understand that that we as survivors of this have been conditioned to believe that the service providers are our enemies. There's a real culture that comes along with belonging to, the life. We believe that we're inherently different from everybody else. And so asking us to trust outsiders is a huge ask and is potentially an unsafe ask. We have experiences that are different. I'm just one survivor, so my experience isn't the same as anyone else's, but I can tell you that I've had buyers who represent just about every social demographic there is. Cops, attorneys, medical providers. So asking kids to trust those members of your team can be really difficult for them if you're not identifying. So we need to be honest as much as we personally can, being real about our roles and our limitations. That's one of the reasons why Amanda and I talked about what are our boundaries and what are our roles and why we really need to be clear about that, because we can do a lot more damage by not being upfront with kids about who we are and what we can and we can't do. We have to remember that these kids very much rely on their intuition, that sixth sense that you learn as a survivor that keeps them alive. And so one of the gifts that we have as survivors is that we can read people probably better than just about anybody else. So we know when people are being deceitful, we know when we're not getting the whole truth out of folks. And so these kids will know if you're not telling them the truth or you're trying to hide things, and that will do a lot of damage to the rapport that you're trying to build. We have to be careful not to take things personally. This isn't about us. So we talked a little bit before about our egos and how they they have to be pretty non-existent in this work. If there's a survivor that is not going to take well to me, but they're going to do well with Amanda, I have to take a step back and say, you know what, that's what's best for the kid. So I'm going to ask Amanda to talk with, you know, him or her about some of these things, or I'm going to rely on Amanda to sort of build that rapport with this person and see if they're open to meeting with me.
That's usually the other way around, just so you guys all know.
So when we talk about this, we often talk about changing the way that we're looking at a success, right? So our traditional model, a lot because our Children's Advocacy Center is district attorney based, we focus heavy on prosecution of cases. And that's not a bad thing, but that can't be the only measurement of success here. So when we talk about successes, we want to look outside the box. So for example, changes in status. Did this kid, when we first knew them, did they go from unemployed and not having, you know, vocational skills to maybe developing that, or maybe now they're enrolled in school they hadn't been going before? There are changes in affect. Maybe there's an increase in their health and well-being, or maybe we've been able to decrease those feelings of hopelessness or other mental health symptoms that they might have. Maybe changes in knowledge means that they can now identify maybe what healthy relationships looks like. That includes their friendships too. Maybe they're starting to understand some of their victimization, learning how to set boundaries for themselves. Maybe they're learning some financial literacy, right? The relationship that survivors of exploitation have with money is a really, really complicated relationship. And then changes in behavior, maybe that means they're running less, or they're generally behaving or reducing the amount of at-risk behaviors that they're having. Maybe there's an increase in their ability to self-regulate or their ability to safety plan with us.
In Plymouth County, as far as prosecutions, we measure success a couple different ways. Obviously, we've also had to shift. Not every case is successful if we get it to prosecution, in part because sometimes we lose a trial, right? So that can't be our only situation of success. Some of my best success stories include not so much winning the trial, but looking at my survivor and knowing I can call that child a survivor, knowing for a fact that that child is now thinking of life goals that they can have instead of just, you know, where's their next meal coming from, or, you know, running away from the group home, whatever it may be. They're actually willing to sit down and try and plan out, maybe I want to go to college, maybe I want to take classes. These are the types of things I want to do for a job. We also, here in Plymouth County, I've been fortunate enough that we've been able to make a big push for prosecuting buyers. We prosecute buyers in this county. I think I've been told repeatedly that we're one of the first in the state to do so. We had a successful prosecution last year. The appeal is currently pending, just as a disclaimer for that. But we're not just going after the exploiter. You have to send a message at some point that it's not just the people that are providing these options, it's also the people that are seeking out these options. If there is no demand, then there's no need for a supply. So the buyer should be held just as accountable in the majority of cases as the person who's actually doing the supplying. So that's one of the things that we've been able to do, that we look at and that we consider.
So I'm not going to get into this at length because we don't have any time left, and I really want to be mindful of your questions and making sure that we're answering them. I've spoke a bit about what our medical response looks like, but just so you have an idea, in our state, our program is run by the Department of Public Health, so a completely separate entity, non-law enforcement, but we are located within the Children's Advocacy Center because we do believe that kids should have access to medical care wherever they land. So if they're coming in to meet with our team, they should be able to receive the appropriate medical services right on site. So all of our PD SANEs across the state, there are 8 of us. We're all advanced practice nurses, and we're really an integral part in if I do say so myself, to the multidisciplinary team, because not all of us think, you know, from the medical mind, but obviously we do. And so our job is really focusing on that patient health and well-being. We're also trained in providing that from a trauma-informed perspective.
as well as I'm going to touch on this, even if Rachel isn't, the fact that they can act as an expert witness for trials, right? One of the biggest things that we run up against in a trial aspect is the idea of, well, there weren't injuries, so it wasn't violent, this didn't happen. Rachel, on more than one occasion, has been able to explain to me when asked, why wouldn't there be injuries in this part of the body? Walk me through that so that I can walk the jury through that. Even if she's not an expert on my case, I can still consult her while I'm preparing for trial and make the determination of if the same nurse is somebody that should be coming in. And I think, frankly, they're underutilized in Massachusetts in our trials.
This is just a picture of the medical suite we have in Plymouth County. It's just to show you that we do the best we can to make this a child-friendly space for kids.
I'm going to skip over to our resources while we answer some questions. Rachel, the first question is about connecting students to information on prevention of unplanned pregnancy and or STDs or STIs. Do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, I mean, we have, I'm not sure, Juliana, if you are located in Massachusetts, but we have some really great organizations, family planning clinics, Planned Parenthoods, lots of different places where kids can have open and honest conversations about these. There are also some really great apps. So Planned Parenthood actually has an app on Instagram, a site on Instagram. I can't think of what it's called right now, of course, but it's all about accessing information about STIs, unplanned pregnancies, or things like that, that's geared towards teens. So it's really accessible for them, and of course they're on social media all the time, so it's a really nice thing for them to have.
Next question is whether or not either of us have seen any particularly effective upstream or prevention strategies employed in alerting children used to the red flags of exploitation and exploiters online or elsewhere. I'm going to say maybe, or kind of, sort of, to that. One of my roles in the DA's office, in addition to being the Director of Human Trafficking Prosecutions, is I also do community outreach. I go out and I present what's called cyber safety presentations to our schools within Plymouth County. And I do it's about an hour-long presentation on all the different things you have to be careful about when it comes to online behavior. I don't gear it specifically towards the red flags of what's happening online because, quite frankly, I think most youth these days aren't going to listen to that. They're already engaged in that behavior and they don't think that, things I tell them pertain to them because they don't think they're in any trouble. So I found some lighter and funnier stories to share with them. And I found some serious exploitation stories to share with them as well. And I interweave all of those things into that presentation. And I would say with almost every presentation I do to the school, there is anywhere from 1 to 20 reports, either self-reports or reports from friends about children who are engaging in dangerous behavior at that point. So we see a pretty sharp uptick with regards to that. So I'd like to think that that's prevention, at least most of the time. It helps, I know it's getting through to some of the people.
We've also been able to work with social service agencies, that was hard, in the county to train them on a few different curriculums. So My Life, My Choice in Boston has a great model for prevention. And so we have some folks in the county that are trained. It was actually just evaluated as part of a study, which is really exciting for them. We've also trained some people on the Word on the Street curriculum, which comes out of Los Angeles, which is another prevention curriculum. So we have folks in the county that are presenting on that.
As far as school nurses being involved, Rachel, I don't know if you have a different perspective, but I think from my perspective, from the DA's office perspective, the school nurses have to file a 51A if they have concerns. And then depending on the information that they have, sometimes we fold them into our multidisciplinary team, our initial conference call and response of information gathering. And then they can reach out to us for presentations and trainings anytime they want. So I don't want to say they're necessarily as involved as they want to be, but when we know about them and we know information they have, we make them as involved as they can be.
Yeah, I would say the same.
And to the extent that there are concerns about the financial dependency on the trafficker, you're absolutely right. Massachusetts, I don't know if it's especially Massachusetts or not, but I can only speak for Massachusetts. We're an underserviced state. We don't have enough resources for these people. That doesn't mean that we don't try, which obviously is the insinuation there, but I think it's more of a question of what can we do for these people. And the reality is that we're not doing enough just yet. But we're working on it. There are constantly new shelters that are being opened, new trainings that are going on out there. We do have the Human Trafficking Victims Fund that is working on getting funding because it exists, but I don't think has a whole lot of money in it, if any, just yet. You know, so those are all things that we look at, and certainly challenges that we face and challenges that the victim and the survivors face when they're trying to get out of that lifestyle.
So if there are no more questions, we will wrap it up. I really want to thank everyone for taking your time to listen to us, and maybe we can provide our contact information to Sarah and Oscar at NECAT. If you have any follow-up questions, they can get those to us, and we can hopefully get those back to you.
Amanda and Rachel, one more quick question that I don't think you got to was around your team understanding. Are there any particular personality assessments that you guys utilize in figuring out your strengths and weaknesses as a team? I don't know if you want to answer that really quickly, maybe.
As far as personality surveys or anything that we do to try and recognize, we haven't done that yet, in part because our team is still pretty small. I tend to be one of the only prosecutors that respond. Sometimes I will hand select a backup for a specific case if I can't be there. So I just try and go with my intuition based on my facts and knowledge of the case. And then we kind of go for our team from there, but mostly we count on, and sometimes it backfires. I mean, we're still learning on it, but mostly we count on everybody kind of knowing themselves well enough. And I would say there have been times where a child has come in and a child has met us and said, I don't like that police officer. Okay, well, I guess we won't have that police officer come back. You know, we'll try and find a different one that, you know, might be a little easier for you to relate to. So we take the information that we have and check ourselves and know ourselves. And then sometimes when we meet the child, we learn that we were wrong, and we do what we can to adjust if we can adjust. So.
Excellent. Well, Amanda and Rachel, thank you so much. That was wonderful, full of insight and practical tips. So thank you again, and thank you everyone for joining us. Oscar and I with NECAT will be in touch about future webinars, but always feel free to check out our website to listen to past webinars as well. So thanks again, Rachel and Amanda. It was just wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, everyone.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Goodbye.